When we think of the Spanish-American War, we often hear about heroes, explosions, and headlines from media giants like Hearst and Pulitzer. But what about the forces working behind the scenes? What about the lesser-known voices, small newspapers, pro-Cuban groups, and business corporations who quietly shaped how Americans saw the conflict? My name is Patrick, and my capstone explores this question. How did lesser-known media outlets and public corporations shape the public perception of the Spanish-American War? Was the Spanish-American War really just the United States looking out for the rest of the Western Hemisphere, or were there bigger intentions behind the entire operation? When you look back into the history books, you see some of the factors that influenced the U.S. government's intervention in the Caribbean. Yellow journalism was certainly a large contributor to the war, shaping the public's image of the Spanish, shaping the narrative that the U.S. needed to help. Once the USS Maine was destroyed, the U.S. had the ability to enter into the war for their own reasons, seeing as how the USS Maine was not destroyed by the Spanish, rather an internalized error in technology. So what were some of the real reasons behind the United States' entry into the Spanish-American War? American corporations, especially those in the sugar and tobacco industries, had enormous financial stakes in Cuba. When the Cuban War of Independence broke out, Spanish control meant instability, and instability meant lost profits. In 1934, historian J.W. Pratt wrote, "Naturally enough, some firms suffering under these conditions better desired to see the United States intervene to end the war. In other words, corporations were fine with military conflict as long as it protected their profits and businesses. These corporations did not care about the Cubans. They cared about the sugar and tobacco plantations." One report claimed the Cuban War had caused an average loss of $100 million a year. To think that a sector of American business losing hundreds of millions of dollars per year was fine with the U.S. government is outright delusional. However, instead of telling the public, "We're losing money," the U.S. framed their concern as a humanitarian crisis. One corporation stated that they hoped to secure the blessings of peace for 1.5 million of residents of the island of Cuba now enduring unspeakable distress. This certainly sounded noble, but it was simply not the main concern. Money was the driving force. Even the Commercial and Financial Chronicle, a newspaper in 1898, admitted that, although war meant sacrifice, it was worth it for long-term prosperity, stating that, "If our cause is just, then, although war is hell, the fact that it calls for a sacrifice of material interests is a matter of no moment." The public media knew that the war would be ugly, but the war would be profitable. At the end of the day, it came down to the fact that it was okay to lose lives if it meant that raw materials could be saved. Corporations weren't the only ones that shaped public opinion. The Cuban junta, a pro-Cuban liberation group with chapters across the U.S., especially in New York and Florida, shaped the public's perspective on the war in great strides. The junta worked alongside smaller media outlets to spread sympathy for the Cuban cause. Their main goal was simply to get rid of the Spanish by any means necessary. Historian George Oxy described their efforts in removing the Spanish through the use of sympathy meetings, carnivals, theatrical performances, public addresses, and pamphlets. These weren't just small and meaningless charity events, they were targeted propaganda campaigns. The junta went as far as to send the U.S. government published pamphlets like Facts About Cuba, which painted the Spanish as brutal dictators. One part of the pamphlet reads, "The Captain Generals transformed themselves into irresponsible dictators, neglecting their duty to make money at all hazards." Another excerpt warned that Cubans were incarcerated, exiled, and put to death. These stories and propaganda events stirred emotion and rallied support, especially in the Midwest where pro-Cuban sentiment grew quickly. As Oxy stated, the Midwest furnished a potentially productive psychological area for propaganda to thrive. Many people know about yellow journalism, but not many people have heard of the junta, who had a direct impact on swaying the U.S. government and its citizens into a pro-Cuban sentiment. Another sector that had a large impact on the public's perception of the Spanish-American War is seen with the lesser-known media outlets. Small newspapers who were looking for a story that would sell were pleased to cooperate with the junta's efforts. Many Midwestern, lesser-known newspapers published articles demonstrating the junta's propaganda. For these lesser-known media outlets, backing the war wasn't because they felt bad for the Cubans, it was because they could make money on the story. The media outlets relayed what the junta wanted to spread. The junta claimed that the only object of the Spaniards was to enrich themselves with the large profits arising from the inhumane traffic. The junta helped the U.S. government to play out the narrative that the Cuban people were suffering, and while not entirely false, it was very much exaggerated, and they used Midwestern newspapers to get that message across to the public. It goes to say that the Spanish-American War was not solely a humanitarian crisis that the government sought out on their own. There were influences. The lesser-known media companies were a major influence because the war was an opportunity for profit. They didn't truly care for the Cubans. They cared that the Cuban crisis could make them money.
Please excuse my interruption. I, William McKinley, can confirm that what Mr. Ryan is saying is true. I entered into the Spanish-American War because I was being pressured by the sugar and tobacco companies. I would say that this video you are watching is one of the greatest sources you could be hearing from, and you should be paying extremely close attention to the information being presented. Please resume listening. Thank you.
The Spanish-American War didn't just start with a destroyed battleship or headline. It started well before that. It just hadn't yet been announced. The Spanish-American War truly started with pamphlets and news articles and rallies and rhetoric. Corporations framed the war as a humanitarian crisis so that they could make more profit, and the junta made sure the people believed it, and the lesser-known media companies got it to the people. Together, corporations and lesser-known media outlets reshaped American perception and pushed the nation towards war. It could be argued that the U.S. had no sympathy for the Cuban people at all. To leave you with the final message, the Spanish-American War isn't exactly what you think it was, and it certainly didn't start the way you think it did. Regardless, it's important for everyone to understand a piece of history that isn't largely regarded as public opinion, but meanwhile is often the opinion of those who were affected. Thank you.